Okay, so 2009, B, number 2. In country Z, the required reserve ratio is 10%. Assume that the central bank sells $50 million in government securities in the open market and wants you to calculate each of the following. So the first thing we have to do is calculate the total change in reserves in the banking system. The second thing we have to do is calculate the maximum possible change in the money supply. All right. So normally for questions like this, what I like to do is I like to set it up with just some basic information right out of the gate. So we know the reserve requirement is equal to 10%. We know that the money multiplier is equal to 1 over the reserve requirement. So in this case, the money multiplier is going to be equal to 10. And the reason why I do that right out of the gate is because now I know I have all that information for me right there in the first problem. So if I'm called upon to use the multiplier later on in the problem, I have all that information. I don't have to think to myself, all right, 1 over 0.1 or whatever it might be. I just can look and be like, okay, like money multiplier is 10. So for the first portion of the question, it is going to ask us, well, what is the initial change in reserves? In the question, it says that the reserve ratio is 10% and that the central bank is going to sell $50 million, dollars in bonds. If the Fed is selling 50 million in bonds, then we know that the Fed is actually going to be taking, wait, hold on, I need to double check this before I will make sure I don't say the wrong thing. Yeah. All right. So the Fed is going to sell $50 million in government securities on the open market. So it's going to be selling $50 million in bonds. If I am the Fed and I am selling you a bond, I am now taking on cash. If the Fed is going to sell $50 million in bonds, we know that the initial change in reserves in the entire banking system is going to be $50 million because that is the amount of money that the Fed is now taking, from banks. So A1 is going to be 50 million. And it's a 50 million reduction. It doesn't ask if it's a reduction or not. It just asks what happens. So A1 is 50 million. And as always, guys, if you have any questions, please just unmute yourself and ask. The next question is going to ask, well, what is the total change in bank reserves in the entire money supply? What is the maximum possible change in the money supply? For this, we now know we have to apply the money multiplier. So we are now going to take 50 million, times 10, because it's the money multiplier, which means that we are going to have a maximum possible change of $500 million, into the economy. And what is that going to do? There's going to be a $500 million reduction in the money supply. All right, and that is A. Okay, so let's move on to B here. All right, B is asking for us, I believe we have to draw a graph. Okay, B, using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show the impact of the central bank's bond sale on the nominal interest rate. Okay, so we know that for this, we're going to draw the money market. And our money market oh, that's bad. That's worse. All right. So our money market is nominal interest rate, the vertical. We have the quantity of money, the horizontal axis. We have our demand for money, and we have the money supply. where the money supply meets or intersects rather with the demand for money, we have our nominal interest rate. Okay, so we know that the Fed is going to sell bonds. If the Fed sells bonds, we know that it is going to shrink the money supply. If the money supply shrinks, then it is going to shift to the left. Money supply shifts to the left. Our new nominal interest rate is higher than the initial nominal interest rate. Because our new nominal interest rate is higher than the initial interest rate, we know that a couple of things are going to happen in our economy. We don't even know what the next question is going to be, but we know this. If nominal interest rate increases, that means that consumer spending is going to decrease because borrowing is going to decrease. It also means that investment is going to decrease. Okay, and the reason why business investment is going to decrease is because now it's more expensive to borrow money. If we were looking in the foreign exchange market, so this would have been something else that used to be required to know, but the foreign exchange market would say, well, if interest rates increase, believe it or not, capital inflows to our country are going to increase because people are going to want to invest, okay, and pretty much lend money for a higher interest rate. So that would actually increase our exports, believe it or not. But we don't need to necessarily go into that. All you need to know is that consumption and investment are both going to decrease. Okay. C, what is the impact of the central bank's bond sale and the equilibrium price level in the short run? Well, we know this. We just said that both consumption and investment will decrease. Okay. If consumption and investment decreases, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. Okay, which means that price level is going to decrease in the short run. Okay. All right. D, as a result of the price level change in part C, are people with fixed incomes better off, worse off, or unaffected? And explain your answer. And this one, we've talked a little bit about fixed incomes before, but we know this. Okay, if consumption and investment both decrease and price level decreases, if I live off of $25,000 a year and price level is, I don't know, if we were to give it a number between 1 and 10, if price level is at an 8 and I make $25,000 per year, if price level in aggregate decreases from an 8 to say a 5, that $25,000 that I currently make per year is going to have a greater stretch. I'm going to be able to purchase more money with it. So people with fixed incomes are actually better off because that $25,000 will purchase more goods than previously. Okay, so we'll be able to buy more with that, whatever, fixed income. Okay, and the $25,000, guys, is just the number I gave you, saying like if we were living on a $25,000 fixed income. All right, that is 2009B number 2. Before I erase all of this and we go to 2014 number 2, if you have any questions, just mute yourself and ask. Everybody good with this one before I erase it off of the whiteboard? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a winter mug. It says Cocoa for Santa. Don't judge me. The biggest mug I have in the house. That's clean. All right, here we go. Clearing the whiteboard. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so the next one is going to be 2014 number 2. All right. So 2014 number 2, the Federal Reserve can influence the supply of money. Assume that the Federal Reserve targets a lower federal funds rate. Just a reminder, the federal funds rate is the rate of interbank lending, right? So we know we have the discount window and the federal funds rate. The spread is what we call the difference between the two. It's usually about 1%, and the federal funds rate is the rate of which banks charge each other to borrow funds from each other. This is what the Fed would rather banks use as opposed to using the discount window, all right? So assume that the Fed targets a lower federal funds rate. In order for us to lower the federal funds rate, we just need to target lower interest rates in general. The federal funds rate's an interest rate, so it's going to function the same way. So if we wanted to lower the federal funds rate, we need to lower nominal interest rate in general, all right? So A1, what open market operation can the Federal Reserve use to lower this target? Okay, so here we are. We have 2014. Number 2, okay, okay, we want to lower federal funds rate, okay, which means we need to nominal interest rate, all right? So in this case, we want to know what open market operations are we going to use? Open market operations is buying and selling of bonds. In this scenario, since we want to lower nominal interest rate, we want to buy bonds, okay? So the Fed is going to buy bonds to target a lower federal funds rate, all right? Now, given your answer into part A1, what will happen now to the price of bonds? I don't know if you guys remember this, but in class, we had talked a little bit about, we had talked about the relationship between bond prices and interest rate. So we know if interest rates are going to decrease and they are going to lower, bond prices and interest rates have an inverse relationship. So if my interest rate is going to decrease, that means that previously issued bonds, remember, there's a secondary market for this stuff. People can buy and sell previously issued bonds before they mature, and you can use the previously issued interest rate. So for example, if the current nominal interest rate in the United States is 2%, but I'm holding onto a bond that has an 8% yield, that means I have a very, very valuable bond. So now, if interest rates are decreasing, the worth or the value of my bond on the open market to be traded is now going to increase. So if interest rates go down, bond prices will increase. Okay, and it's bond prices on previously issued bonds. Okay, so it's previously issued bonds. All right, let's look at B. Using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show the effect of the open market operation on the nominal interest rates. Okay, so now this is the one where they're like, okay, well, we want to see, show your work pretty much. All right, and this is the portion of the AP exam this year that you're pretty much not really going to have to do, but I'm making you guys practice this anyway so you get used to thinking in this way, because realistically, to answer these questions at home, you are going to have to graph this stuff out, most likely on scrap paper, okay? And it's just easier for you to, it takes a layer of thinking out of it because you're just so used to drawing the graphs. It's a lot easier than you might think. The nice thing about macro is, since there are not as many graphs as micro or markets to remember and things like that, with repetition, you just kind of really get pretty good at drawing the graphs and then figuring out what's going to happen. And I know you guys are all diligently practicing this on your own because you are unbelievably motivated during this time.
Sounds about right.
Thank you.
I said it better.
Yeah, I know. I've had a conversation with teachers, like in our department, just kind of talking about, like, what they're seeing with their students and stuff like that. So, feel you guys. I feel you. All right. So here we go. So now we know that, where am I? Here we go. So we know that we are going to buy bonds, which is going to increase the money supply. So by increasing the money supply, okay, what's going to happen is when I increase the money supply, nominal interest rate is going to decrease, okay? Because where the money supply intersects with the demand for money, lets us know that nominal interest will decrease. Okay, and that is our graph. All right, let's look at the next portion. C, assume that the Federal Reserve buys government bonds from commercial banks. Based only on this transaction, will the level of required reserves in the commercial banks increase, decrease, or remain the same? Okay, so now this is kind of a question that's meant to, trip you up a little bit. And the reason why is this. The answer for C is going to be remain the same. Uh-oh, what just happened? What did I just do? I just closed out what I was looking at. Just give me 1 second, guys. Sorry. Technical difficulty. User error. All right. So again, it's asking what is going to happen to the amount of assuming the Federal Reserve buys government bonds from commercial banks. Based on this transaction, will the level of required reserves in the commercial banks increase, decrease, or remain the same? So our bank reserves going to change. Our bank's going to be required to change their required reserves. And the answer is that there is no impact, initially at least, on the bank reserves. And the reason being is because it's the transaction of bonds. It's not a demand deposit. Someone's not coming into their checking account, taking money out, or putting money into it. So there is going to be no initial change. So it's kind of like a trick question. It wants to make sure that you know the difference between a demand deposit and bonds inside of a bank balance sheet. All right, last one. Sorry, I didn't write this out here. So C is no change. Okay. And then the last one here is D. And D says another monetary policy action involves changing the discount rate. Define the discount rate. Okay, the discount rate, also called the discount window, is the rate of interest. Okay, the Fed charges commercial banks. All right, so again, if you're going to borrow from the Federal Reserve using the discount window, it means that you are going to be borrowing money from the Fed. The discount rate is just the rate of interest that the Fed is going to charge commercial banks to borrow from. And this is why the Fed prefers that, or will target a federal funds rate, because the Fed prefers that banks borrow from each other as opposed to borrowing from them. In class, I used the analogy of like, well, would you rather borrow money from your friends to cover a gambling bet, or would you rather borrow money from your parents to cover for a gambling bet? And the majority of you said you're going to borrow money from your friends because, one, you don't want your parents to know that you're gambling, and two, you don't really want to disclose that you're losing money. So it's a lot easier to have that conversation with a friend than it is to have with your parent. Same thing, right? If you're a bank that likes to over leverage itself, you kind of like to live life on the edge, trying to make money and turn profits, and you're really, really running close to not meeting your reserve requirement each and every day, you're not going to go to the Fed to cover your gambling habits. You're going to go to a friend to help you out until it gets really bad, and then you have to tell the Fed or mom and dad, like, hey, I'm really in the hole. I kind of need help because someone's coming to break my legs. All right. I know Tim's not here, but he might be able to speak to that a little. Okay. And that is
too bad Tim or West. That would have been 10 times better.
That's 2014 number 2. Before I erase it, does anybody have any questions? Okay. Last one, guys. All right, so the last one is 2017 number 2. It's just the one right underneath it. Okay, and so let's look at assume. Oh, I need to flip page. Oh. This is a good one. Quantity of money, quantity theory of money, and velocity of money in this one gets me excited. All right, 2017. Assume that an economy is in long-run equilibrium. Assume that the consumers wish to hold less money because they use credit cards more frequently to purchase goods and services than cash. Okay, so this is a shifter question, right? This is a shifter question. So here we go. 2017. Number 2. A is we want to know what's going to happen. So draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect of the reduced holdings of money on the equilibrium nominal interest rate in the short run. Okay, so we are going back to the money market graph. And again, the reason why is because they're talking about our demand for money. Okay, this is a demand shifter. So far, we have done, I believe, 4 FRQs or 5 FRQs that have involved the money market. Out of the 4 or 5 that we've done, half of them have called on you to identify the shifters of the demand for money. Okay, so it is important to the College Board. It's something that you guys should make sure is important to you as well. I think having the, for the AP exam, by the way, I think having the ultimate review guide next to you, or at least maybe having like a, I don't know, if you have a digital copy or what, or having a printed out copy, but having that next to you as like a reference for things you might kind of get hung up on, I think might be a good idea. Okay. So here is our money market account. We know that now people are holding less money because they're using credit cards. This is me. I am this person. I am represented in this equation. I lose everything all the time. I can't tell you, you probably ask my wife, the number of money clips and wallets she has purchased me over the last 20 years because I'm unbelievably forgetful. So I just don't hold cash anymore. I just use debit cards or credit cards or things like that because of loss. So I am this person, right? So because of that, my demand for physical cash in hand has decreased dramatically because I do everything online. And so if I'm one person, okay, that this impacts, if it impacts a number of people and we all have the same end result, the demand for money is actually going to decrease. Okay. Man, this is great. A lot of people who I was going to email today, so I haven't seen you guys in a while. You guys showed up to class. I like it. Okay. So because the demand for money decreases, our nominal interest rate is actually going to decrease as well because our demand, our need for physical cash on hand is not going to be the same. So that's what our graph is going to look like for A. For B, based on the change in the interest rate in part A, what will happen to each of the following in the short run? 1, prices of previously issued bonds, and 2, okay, the price level and real income, and explain. So let's go here. B. Oh. Okay, so B1 is what happens to the price of previously issued bonds. We just answered this question in the previous one, but this was based on a change in the money supply. Now this is not based on a change in the money supply. This is based on the change in demand, okay, for cash or for money. Since nominal interest rates now are going to decrease, the value of bonds or previously issued bonds is going to increase, right? They have that inverse relationship. So bond prices will increase. And again, this is based off of previously issued bonds, right? Bonds that we can now buy and sell or trade in the open market. All right, let's look at number 2. Number 2 for B asks, what happens to price level and real income? And you need to explain your answer. We're looking at this. We know that nominal interest rate is going to decrease. If nominal interest rate decreases, okay, so because nominal interest rate decreases, consumption and investment will increase, okay? So we know that people are now going to borrow to make large ticket purchases, maybe finance things that need additional funds to purchase. Businesses, because interest rates are low, are going to engage in capital formation and borrow to invest in their company. These two things are represented in aggregate demand. And because aggregate demand is going to shift to the right, we know that price level will increase, and income will also increase. Okay? As price level increases, so does income, right? Because as price level and output increase, more people are employed. If more people are employed, that means they're earning an income. Therefore, everybody in the economy in aggregate is earning more income. Okay? All right. That is B. Let's look at C. With a constant money supply, based on your answer to part B2, will the velocity of money increase, decrease, or remain the same, or is the change indeterminate? Okay, so I don't know if you guys remember this. Maybe some of you had to go back and look it up, or maybe some of you just said, you know what, screw it, I'm just going to go to the answer key. I'll put it down, and then I'll wait for Mr. McSweeney, okay, to talk about it in class, which is also fine. All right, so we know that
the easiest way.
What's that?
It's the easiest way.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, so we have the quantity theory of money says this. The quantity theory of money says that M times V is equal to P times Y. Okay? M stands for the money supply, right? I'm not going to write all that out. M stands for the money supply, V stands for the velocity of money, P stands for price level, and Y stands for output. Okay? And so let's think about this. Maybe we can refresh our memories just a little bit, right? Velocity of money is the rate at which it takes a dollar to change hands, right? So how many times does the one same dollar change hands from person to person via transactions inside of a year, and what is that rate like? We give that a rating number. The velocity of money typically inside of economies does not fluctuate. In short run, sure, it does fluctuate. In the long run, it's actually pretty constant. And when we look at the quantity theory of money, we kind of eliminate two variables out of the equation to kind of make this very, very simple. So velocity of money, rather constant in the long run. On the other side of the equation, okay, Y, or output for the most part, is also pretty constant. Real GDP, yes, it does increase, but it increases slowly over time. So if we know that V for the most part remains constant and Y also remains constant, we then know that anytime there is a change in the money supply, there is also going to be an equal change in the price level. Okay, so that's just a basic recap of what the quantity theory of money says. That's not necessarily going to help you answer this question. So in this question, all of the variables have actually already been impacted for us, and the one that hasn't, they've given us what's going to happen. So in the question, it says that if M is constant, okay, so if the money supply remains constant, what happens to the velocity of money? Well, in our previous answers, since interest rates decreased and aggregate demand shifted to the right, we know that P for price level is going to increase. We also know that in the short run, Y for this case is also going to increase. If M remains constant and both P and Y increase, then V, or velocity of money, must also increase to make sure that the equation equals out on both sides. So in this case, the velocity of money will increase. Okay. Now I'm going to give it a second. If you have any questions, unmute yourself, ask. This is always kind of like a tricky one.
What does the Y stand for again?
It stands for output, or like real GDP.
Okay.
No? We're good? All right, cool. I'm about to sneeze though. All right, D, if the central bank wishes to reverse the change in the interest rate identified in part A, what open market operations would it use? So we know that in part A, looking at our graph, we know that the demand for money shifting to the left decreased interest rates. Now we want to increase interest rates. We know that if the Fed was going to buy bonds from commercial banks, they would be handing banks cash, which therefore would increase the money supply. So in this case, the Fed is going to sell bonds. Remember, bonds, the purchasing of bonds and selling of bonds is open market operation. All right, and that is 2017 number 2. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right.
No, sir.
Wait, so if we sell bonds, it decreases the money supply or increases? I forget.
When we sell, I'm sorry, when we sell bonds, it will decrease the money supply. So if you're thinking about it like this, and I actually do this all the time, I always like to have like someone around me or pretend like I'm talking to an imaginary person. Okay. So if you're the Fed and somebody across from you was the bank, just go through that actual transaction by putting yourself in their shoes, and it makes it a lot easier. So if I am the Fed and Morgan, you are a commercial bank, if I am going to sell bonds, that means that you are going to take them. So I'm going to hand you bonds, and in return, you're going to give me cash for them as part of that transaction. So it's going to be taking money out of the money supply.
Okay.
Any other questions? No? All right, guys. Thanks so much for coming to class. Always good to hear and see from you. If there's anything you guys need, please let me know. That's all I got.